ESPN believes the Commanders have a major problem at wide receiver behind Terry McLaurin, while many others in and out of the organization say Antonio Williams is primed for a great rookie season. We'll take a look at another area on the roster for Washington that's probably a bigger concern. What's up, everybody, and welcome in. I'm your host, Carl McManus, and today on Commanders Digest, we'll take a look at a perceived roster hole. I say perceived because I think the Commanders have actually done a really good job at this position this offseason, including a bunch of names that are still available in free agency and a rookie that is ready to step up. And then we'll finally look at the actual roster hole that I have in my mind for the Commanders' 53-man roster. So first, starting with the problems at wide receiver, Aaron Schatz of ESPN writes an article, "The biggest roster hole for all 32 teams following the NFL draft." He starts by saying there's a collection of players behind Terry McLaurin waiting for someone to break out. Is Treylon Burks ready to be the starter? Can Luke McCaffrey expand upon his second season? Is rookie Antonio Williams ready for the big time? The Commanders also have Jaylen Lane, who had a decent rookie season, then veteran Deebo Brown, who struggled in Jacksonville in 2025. So first and foremost, we all know that behind Terry McLaurin, the Commanders need somebody to step up. But in the same vein, in the same breath, Aaron Schatz mentions a bunch of names who Washington could potentially look at to fill that void. Now, I said that I think Washington has already done a very good job at this position. We'll break that down and take a look at some other reasons why I think Washington could have a lot of success in the wide receiver room, in the pass catching department for Jayden Daniels this season. But first, I want to pause and give a quick shout out to the sponsor of this video, Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 sports picks app, and it is the best way to get in on the action. In fact, I'll show you some of the picks I'm making later on this video, but for now, download Prize Picks using the link in the description, and don't forget to use our code DIGEST because it really helps me and this channel out, but it also helps you out with $50 instantly in your lineups when you play your first $5. Speaking about lineups for Washington, we're taking a look at the wide receiver room. Now, I don't necessarily think Aaron Schatz is totally wrong. Yes, they need somebody to step up outside of Terry McLaurin, but like I said, he mentioned a lot of names who could have very good seasons. Treylon Burks, a former first-round pick who, yes, hasn't necessarily lived up to the billing, and then multiple picks in consecutive years for Washington that are expected to be able to fill that role. Guys like Terry McLaurin weren't first-round picks. Neither was Luke McCaffrey, Jaylen Lane, and Antonio Williams. And while I don't say that they are Terry McLaurin, a guy like Antonio Williams has already been compared to a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, one of the best wide receivers in the league, who, of course, slipped to the second round for the Detroit Lions. When you factor in that a lot of people already say Antonio Williams looks like him, a guy that slipped later in the draft, a guy that was a slot wide receiver mostly in college, but has a very good route running ability, and then comes up in a Ben Johnson style offense, of course, with David Blau now being the offensive coordinator here in Washington. So while a guy like Aaron Schatz thinks Washington has a major hole at wide receiver, Field Yates of ESPN kind of contradicts him by saying a guy like Antonio Williams is ready to fit in immediately. An article by Phil Yates saying the instant impact rookies who were taken on day 2 or day 3. Draft, fit, and position are why Williams cracks this list. He is extremely experienced, savvy, and pro-ready wideout who can start in the slot from day 1. So there's an avenue already for Antonio Williams to be able to slide in easily for this offense. Continuing reading, the Commanders needed receiver help alongside Terry McLaurin, and Williams will compete with players such as Deebo Brown, Luke McCaffrey for snaps. He loves Williams' instincts. He was a persistent chain mover at Clemson. So yes, Antonio Williams probably more of a slot to start his career, but Washington, Adam Peters, David Blau, this whole regime believes that he has enough versatility to be able to compete on the outside as well. Just like Amon-Ra St. Brown when he started with the Detroit Lions, more of a slot wide receiver from the start, but then was able to progressively show his skills, show that, yes, a very good route runner. Antonio Williams not necessarily going to be the best in terms of separation, but a very good route runner, just like Terry McLaurin, is able to get enough separation where he can then use his speed to further influence the play. So I think a guy like Antonio Williams is able and ready to step up for that perceived roster hole. Taking a look at what Washington has done this offseason, Terry McLaurin is the X wide receiver. He's the #1. All those names we mentioned, Treylon Burks, who showed some flashes with some really good catches, including that one-handed touchdown catch in the corner of the end zone against Denver. Van Jefferson, who has a Super Bowl to his name. Deebo Brown, who, yes, has kind of not lived up to the billing as a former third-round pick by not this regime, but Ron Rivera. Showed some flashes as well. Disappointing season for Jacksonville last year. And outside of 2024, hasn't done too much in his career, but then was Washington's leading wide receiver in the playoffs in that 2025 run. Then they have in the slot Antonio Williams, who of course can play in the slot, and then on the outside, that's Washington's belief, Luke McCaffrey, really good kick returner, showed some flashes as well, over 100 yards, touchdowns in consecutive games for the Commanders before ultimately succumbing to injury. And then Jaylen Lane, who has some drop problems in the receiving game and then some muff problems in the punt return game, but was the NFL's leading punt returner. Yes, that doesn't necessarily translate to being effective in the passing game, but he's shown some flashes with that speed, the ability to get open. He's just got to be able to bring in the ball a little bit better. And I think, with more comfort in the NFL, he can absolutely do that. And then also the opportunities that he'll be given in the punt return game and possibly the kick return game will allow him even more runway to be able to take off. So those are all the reasons why I don't necessarily think wide receiver is the major hole for Washington. And then one more thing before I move on, there are also a good amount of free agents that are out there that could still end up in Washington and make that wide receiver room even better. This isn't even including Brandon Ayuk, who technically isn't a free agent, technically still under roster with the San Francisco 49ers. But once and if that ever happens, we already know that he's most likely going to sign with Washington. Outside of that, there's Tyreek Hill, who's coming back from an injury and is on the older end, so I'm not necessarily pressed about him. There's Stephon Diggs, who still showed in 2025, coming back from an ACL injury in 2024, can be a very productive wide receiver. In fact, the New England Patriots leading wide receiver in 2025, the team that made it to the Super Bowl. There's still Deebo Samuel out there, who of course Adam Peters is familiar with his time in San Francisco. It's the reason he traded for him, so he already gave up draft capital for him, has a role in this offense, though seeming less and less likely because he hasn't signed up to this point. Curtis Samuel, former Washington football player, I don't necessarily see it happening. And then DeAndre Hopkins, who yes is on the down end of his career. He'll be 34 by the time the season starts, but showed in Baltimore that he still has a very niche role in the NFL, just like Davante Adams has for the Los Angeles Rams. I'm not saying he is Davante Adams. Davante Adams still has juice, but they're from the same draft class. DeAndre Hopkins, target in the red zone, very good one if Jayden Daniels needs that. But those are reasons why I think Washington doesn't necessarily have a big hole at wide receiver. Where I think their bigger hole is in the secondary. Taking a look at the secondary depth chart, specifically at cornerback, we know they only really have Trey Amos and Mikey Sandersdale. They signed Ahkello Witherspoon. They brought back Antonio Hamilton, who more of a special teamer, but is the Jackson Dart stopper, and then Amik Robertson in the slot. And even in the secondary, Washington, who had the worst or the third worst coverage defense, according to Pro Football Focus, hasn't done too much to better that. Maybe having Durante Jones in there, who turned around Minnesota secondary, maybe having a better offensive or defensive front seven, getting more pressure on the quarterback will allow the secondary to be stickier in coverage. But as of now, they haven't done enough, in my opinion, to warrant that being a strength for the team, for the defense, especially considering that they were one of the worst in the NFL this past season. So we've talked about everybody that's still out there. Marshawn Lattimore's not coming back. Trayvon Diggs, an opportunity here in DC. L'Jarius Sneed, somebody that fits the mold with Washington. Jimmy Ward's a safety. We talked about Kenny Moore. He's more of a slot cornerback. I said cornerback this time. Tre'Davious White, his career has gone off the rails, and while he had a slight resurgence in Buffalo, still not enough. Jeff Okudah, a lot of injury issues, multiple concussions, has been a bust as a former third overall pick by the Detroit Lions. Yes, he spent last year in that Durante Jones system in Minnesota, so maybe they want to bring him in. Najee Johnson, another special teamer. Adoree Jackson on the downside of his career, over 30. Chris Boyd, I don't know why he's even on this list. And then Rasul Douglas, somebody that I'd actually be interested in. Yes, on the wrong side of 30 as well. He'll be 32 by the time the season starts. But you see, taking a look at his stats, he had 2 interceptions, 13 passes defensed, and according to Pro Football Focus, this past year was still one of the best cornerbacks, and you see his usage. He's a wide cornerback. He's got the height, 6'2". So Washington, to address that area of need that I still see at cornerback, Rasul Douglas, could still be one of those players that they take a look at. But that's all I have for this video. We took a look at the perceived roster hole, I think Washington has a lot of options at wide receiver already on the roster, including a lot of options that are still available in free agency and a rookie that is ready to break out. And then we took a look at the actual roster hole, which I believe is still in the secondary. The Commanders don't have a lot of depth at cornerback. A lot of their safeties struggled in 2025 on the current roster. Yes, they addressed that with Nick Cross, but let me know down in the comments what you think the actual roster hole on this roster is. Is it wide receiver? Is it secondary / cornerback, or is it a completely different area that I'm overlooking? Let me know what you think down in the comments. But we've reached the end of this video, so it's time for our prize picks. Taking a look at Ousmane Dembele going against Lens, I have him going for less than 3 shots. I don't think he plays the full match. PSG is 6 points ahead of Lens on the table. Only 2 matches remaining, so yes, Lens technically could catch them, but I don't see that happening. I don't think PSG plays their full starters for the full match. I have Ousmane Dembele going for less than 3 shots against Lens, and I have Vitinha in the midfield leading up to the attack going for less than 100.5 passes attempted. Same reasoning. I don't necessarily think he plays the whole match, so I have him going for less than 100.5 passes attempted. But as always, use your sports knowledge and use Prize Picks. Downloading Prize Picks using the link in the description, and don't forget to use our code DIGEST because it helps me and this channel out, but it also helps you with $50 instantly in your lineups when you play your first $5. Thank you again to Prize Picks for sponsoring this video. Thank you all to you guys for watching this video. Let me know what you think down in the comments. What is the biggest roster hole? And we'll see you next time.